I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez, and I was head of dermatology at Meridian General Hospital in Phoenix, Arizona for 14 years. I've diagnosed over 15,000 skin conditions, published 62 research papers on rare dermatological disorders, and consulted on cases that stumped medical teams across the country. I've seen flesh-eating bacteria, autoimmune conditions that turn skin into armor-like plaques, and genetic mutations that seem to defy nature itself. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about human biology, cellular regeneration, and the very fabric of what makes us human. I submitted my resignation 6 weeks ago, and I've never looked back. Meridian General Hospital is the premier dermatology center for the entire Southwest, serving Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Southern California. Our facility processes over 200,000 patient visits annually, making it one of the busiest dermatology departments in the United States. As department head, I oversaw a team of 12 specialists, managed the largest skin cancer treatment center in the region, and ran clinical trials for experimental treatments that were years ahead of standard care. My office walls were lined with awards, certifications, and photographs from medical conferences in Tokyo, Vienna, and São Paulo, where I'd presented groundbreaking research on melanoma genetics and autoimmune skin disorders. I had been featured in Dermatology Today magazine 3 times, served on the editorial board of the International Journal of Dermatological Sciences, and consulted for pharmaceutical companies developing next-generation treatments for psoriasis and eczema. My success rate for diagnosing rare conditions was 94.7%, a statistic that had been validated by peer review and earned me a reputation as the doctor other doctors called when they encountered something truly unusual. I thought I understood the limits of what human skin could do, how it could fail, and how it could heal. I had seen Stevens-Johnson syndrome turn a patient's skin into blistering sheets that peeled away like wallpaper. I'd watched necrotizing fasciitis consume healthy tissue at an alarming rate, spreading inches per hour despite aggressive surgical intervention. I'd witnessed rare genetic conditions like lamellar that transformed human skin into thick plate-like armor, and epidermolysis bullosa that made skin so fragile that a gentle touch could cause devastating wounds. But nothing in my 14 years of practice, nothing in my extensive education at Johns Hopkins, and nothing in the thousands of medical journals I'd read had prepared me for what I was about to encounter. I was completely, utterly wrong about what I thought was possible. The case that would end my career began on what seemed like a perfectly routine Tuesday morning in late October 2023. Phoenix was experiencing one of its rare overcast days, with unusual cloud cover that made the desert city feel almost mysterious. The Arizona sun was struggling to break through the gray sky at 7:45 a.m. as I reviewed the morning's schedule in my corner office overlooking the hospital's healing garden. We had the usual lineup that filled most of my days: 3 skin cancer screenings for patients over 60, 2 follow-ups on complex psoriasis treatments that required careful monitoring, a suspected case of contact dermatitis in a landscaper who might have encountered poison oak, a teenage patient with severe cystic acne that hadn't responded to conventional treatments, and 1 emergency consultation that had been squeezed in at the last minute by my scheduling coordinator. I was finishing my first cup of coffee, a ritual I never skipped, as it helped me focus for the challenging cases ahead, when my head nurse Maria Santos appeared in my doorway. Maria had worked in dermatology for 12 years, and had been my right hand for the past 8. She was unflappable, professional, and had assisted me through some of the most challenging cases of my career. I'd seen her maintain perfect composure while helping me treat severe burn victims, patients with disfiguring genetic conditions, and even cases of cutaneous anthrax that had been deliberately inflicted. Maria had seen teenage patients with self-inflicted wounds that told stories of deep psychological pain, elderly patients with advanced melanomas that had been ignored for too long, and children with rare genetic conditions that would affect them for their entire lives. She handled each case with the same professional grace and genuine compassion that made her invaluable to our department. But that morning, Maria's usual composed demeanor was nowhere to be found. Her typically perfect posture was slightly hunched, her hands were actually trembling as she clutched a patient file, and her normally warm brown eyes were wide with something that looked like barely controlled panic. In all our years working together, I had never seen Maria look genuinely shaken by anything. "Dr. Vasquez," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we have a situation in examination room 3. The patient is a 25-year-old woman named Isabella Chen. She drove here from Tucson this morning. That's over 2 hours, because she said no doctor there would believe what was happening to her skin." Maria paused, seeming to struggle with her words, glancing back toward the examination rooms, as if she expected something impossible to follow her down the hallway. "Elena," she continued, using my first name, which she only did in the most serious situations, "I've worked with you for over a decade. I've seen patients with skin conditions that would give most people nightmares. I've assisted you through cases of toxic epidermal necrolysis, where patients looked like they'd been burned from the inside out. I've helped treat patients with cutaneous lymphoma, whose skin was literally being consumed by cancer. But what's happening to this woman? I don't even have words for it. It's not in any medical textbook I've ever seen, and it's not like anything we've ever discussed in our staff meetings or continuing education seminars. I could see genuine distress in Maria's eyes, mixed with professional confusion, and something that looked almost like fear. Maria wasn't someone who scared easily. She'd worked in emergency departments before joining our dermatology team, and she'd seen trauma cases that would break most people. The fact that she was visibly shaken was enough to make me abandon my coffee immediately and grab my medical bag, dermatoscope and digital camera. Isabella Chen was sitting rigidly upright on the examination table when I entered room 3, her posture so perfect and still that she almost looked like a statue. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and her eyes were fixed on the polished linoleum floor as if she were afraid to make eye contact. She was a petite woman, probably no more than 5 feet 3 inches tall, with long black hair pulled back in a tight ponytail that emphasized the delicate bone structure of her face. She wore a loose-fitting long-sleeve shirt in soft gray cotton and dark jeans, despite the fact that even on this overcast day, Phoenix temperatures were already climbing toward the mid-80s. What immediately struck me was how she held herself, like someone trying to make herself as small as possible, as if she could somehow hide from whatever was happening to her own body. Her breathing was controlled but shallow, and I could see the subtle signs of chronic stress in the tight lines around her eyes and the way her jaw was clenched. This was someone who hadn't been sleeping well, someone who was carrying a burden that was affecting every aspect of her life. "Miss Chen," I said gently, pulling up the rolling chair so I could sit at her eye level rather than towering over her. "I'm Dr. Vasquez. Maria tells me you've been experiencing some unusual skin changes. I want you to know that you're in a safe space here, and whatever is happening, we're going to work together to figure it out. Can you tell me when this started, and what you've been noticing?" Isabella looked up at me slowly, and I saw eyes that held a mixture of exhaustion, fear, desperate hope, and something else, a kind of resignation that suggested she'd been dismissed or disbelieved by other medical professionals. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and there was an intelligence there that told me she understood exactly how unusual her situation was. 3.5 weeks ago, she said, her voice steady but quiet, with just a slight tremor that suggested she was working hard to maintain her composure. "It started small, just a few spots on my shoulders that felt different, warmer than the rest of my skin, like they had their own internal heating system. I thought maybe I had gotten some mild sunburn from hiking in the Catalina Mountains, even though I always wear SPF 50 sunscreen, and usually hike in the early morning when the UV exposure is minimal. But then the spots started changing," Isabella continued, unconsciously touching her left shoulder through her shirt with a movement so gentle it was almost reverent. The skin became different, smoother, almost like it had been polished to a mirror finish. The texture was unlike anything I'd ever felt on human skin. And then, about 2 weeks ago, something started happening that I know sounds impossible. She paused, taking a deep breath as if preparing herself to say something she knew would sound insane. The skin started to glow, not reflect light differently, not change color in a subtle way that might be explained by pigmentation changes, but actually produce its own light, like there are tiny biological LED lights embedded under my skin, generating photons from some internal source. I maintained my professional composure, but internally I was already running through differential diagnoses at lightning speed. Certain autoimmune conditions like dermatomyositis could cause changes in skin texture and appearance. Some rare genetic disorders affecting melanin production could create unusual color variations. There were even documented cases of patients with altered skin pigmentation that made them appear to glow under specific lighting conditions due to the way their skin cells reflected and refracted light. But actual bioluminescence, the production of light through biological processes, was something I'd only encountered in my studies of marine biology during my undergraduate years. Jellyfish, certain types of plankton, deep-sea fish, and some terrestrial organisms like fireflies could produce their own light through complex chemical reactions involving compounds like luciferin and luciferase. But human beings? The idea was scientifically preposterous. When you say glow, Isabella, I need you to be as specific as possible. This is important for my understanding of what we're dealing with. Are we talking about a change in color or pigmentation that might appear to glow under certain lighting conditions? A reflective quality that makes the skin look different? Or are you describing actual light emission, photons being generated by your skin tissue? She looked at me with an expression I'd seen before on the faces of patients who knew they were about to say something that would make them sound delusional. It was the look of someone who had already been dismissed by other doctors, someone who had been told their symptoms were psychosomatic or imagined.
Actual light, Dr. Vasquez. My skin is producing its own photons, generating illumination from some biological process that I can't explain and that no doctor I've seen has been able to explain. And it's spreading every day. More of my normal skin transforms into this impossible glowing tissue, and I can feel it happening cell by cell.
I asked Isabella if she would be comfortable showing me the affected areas, explaining that I needed to see exactly what we were dealing with in order to develop an appropriate diagnostic plan. After a moment of hesitation, and I could see her weighing whether she trusted me enough to reveal what she'd been hiding, she nodded and began to carefully remove her long-sleeve shirt. What I saw when Isabella revealed her shoulders and upper back defied every principle of human biology I had learned during my medical education at Johns Hopkins, my residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, and my 14 years of clinical practice. Patches of her skin, roughly circular areas ranging from the size of a quarter to a silver dollar, were emitting a soft, steady blue-white light that was clearly visible even under the bright fluorescent examination room lighting. This wasn't skin that appeared to glow due to pigmentation changes or reflective properties. This wasn't a trick of lighting or an optical illusion created by surrounding shadows. Isabella's skin was actually producing photons, generating its own illumination like some kind of biological LED array embedded in human tissue. The light was steady, not flickering or pulsing, and had the quality of moonlight, cool, clean, and somehow both alien and beautiful. The luminescent patches had perfectly defined borders where they met her normal skin, creating an almost geometric pattern across her shoulders and upper back. The affected areas covered approximately 30% of her visible skin surface, distributed in a pattern that seemed to follow some kind of internal logic. Clusters near her shoulder blades, a line of patches along her spine, and scattered individual spots that seemed to be spreading outward from central points. The surface texture of the glowing areas was indeed different from normal skin, smoother and almost glass-like in appearance, as if each affected patch had been somehow refined or perfected at the cellular level. I had to blink several times and rub my eyes to make sure I wasn't experiencing some kind of visual hallucination brought on by stress or fatigue. "Isabella," I said, working hard to keep my voice steady and professional despite the fact that my mind was reeling from what I was observing, "I'm going to dim the lights so I can get a better look at the extent and characteristics of these areas. I want to examine them under different lighting conditions to understand exactly what we're dealing with." When I turned off the overhead fluorescence, leaving only the small desk lamp in the corner of the room, the bioluminescent patches became even more pronounced and dramatic. They cast a gentle glow that illuminated not just themselves but the surrounding normal skin, creating an ethereal pattern of light and shadow across Isabella's back that was simultaneously beautiful and deeply unsettling. The light was strong enough that I could clearly see the details of her skin texture, the fine hairs on her arms, and even the small mole near her left shoulder blade. I put on examination gloves and approached her slowly, explaining each step of my examination process to help her feel more comfortable and in control of the situation. When I carefully palpated the affected areas, the luminescent skin felt completely normal in terms of temperature, neither warmer nor cooler than the surrounding tissue. The elasticity was normal, the thickness was consistent with healthy skin, and there were no signs of inflammation, swelling, or any other pathological changes that I could detect through physical examination. "Isabella, I need to ask you some important questions about your symptoms. Does any of this hurt? Are you experiencing any pain, itching, burning, tingling, or other discomfort in the affected areas?" I was running through a mental checklist of every skin condition I'd ever encountered that might produce unusual visual effects, but nothing in my experience came close to matching what I was observing. She shook her head definitively. "No, actually the opposite is true. The glowing areas feel better than in my normal skin, more alive, somehow, like those cells are functioning at a higher level than the rest of my body. The skin there is more sensitive to touch, not painfully sensitive, but more aware. I can feel textures and temperatures more distinctly in those areas. And Dr. Vasquez, I know this sounds crazy, but I can actually feel the light being produced. It's like a gentle warmth and energy that emanates from deep within the tissue." I used my high magnification dermatoscope to examine the border areas between the luminescent and normal skin more closely. What I observed through the magnified lens made my hands begin to tremble slightly despite my years of experience with unusual and challenging cases. At the cellular level, I could see what appeared to be normal human skin cells in the process of some kind of transformation. The cells at the very edges of the luminescent patches showed structural changes that suggested they were reorganizing their internal architecture in ways that shouldn't be possible for differentiated skin cells. I immediately stepped out of the examination room to call in reinforcements. This case was clearly beyond anything I could handle alone, and I needed the expertise of my most experienced colleagues to help me understand what we were dealing with. I contacted Dr. James Rodriguez, our senior dermatopathologist who had been practicing for 23 years and had consulted on some of the rarest skin conditions ever documented in medical literature. I also called Dr. Sarah Kim, our resident expert on genetic skin disorders, who had completed specialized fellowships at both Harvard and the Mayo Clinic and maintained connections with researchers around the world who studied unusual dermatological conditions. Both doctors dropped what they were doing and arrived in examination room 3 within 10 minutes of my call. Dr. Rodriguez entered first, his usual confident demeanor immediately apparent as he greeted Isabella professionally and began reviewing the brief notes I'd hastily compiled. Dr. Kim followed, carrying her specialized diagnostic equipment and a tablet loaded with reference images of every rare genetic skin condition she'd encountered in her 15-year career. When I dimmed the lights and they got their first clear view of Isabella's luminescent skin patches, I watched their professional composure crumble in real time. Dr. Rodriguez actually stumbled backward and had to steady himself against the examination table, his eyes wide with disbelief as he stared at the impossible sight before him. His mouth opened and closed several times as if he were trying to speak but couldn't find words adequate to express what he was seeing. "Elena," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "are we looking at some kind of bioluminescent bacteria that's infected the skin? Maybe a fungal organism that produces light as part of its metabolic process? This cannot be human tissue generating its own photons. It's biologically impossible according to everything we know about human cellular function." Dr. Kim approached more cautiously, her scientific curiosity overriding her initial shock as she pulled out her high-resolution dermatoscope to examine the affected areas. She spent several minutes in complete silence, moving systematically from patch to patch, photographing everything with her specialized medical camera and taking detailed measurements of the size, intensity, and distribution patterns of the luminescent areas. After what felt like an eternity, she looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before in all our years of working together, complete professional bewilderment mixed with genuine fear and excitement. "I've consulted on over 300 rare genetic conditions," she said quietly, her voice containing a tremor that suggested she was struggling to process what she was observing. "I've seen patients with conditions so rare that they affected fewer than 50 people worldwide. I've studied genetic mutations that create skin that looks like tree bark, conditions that make people allergic to their own sweat, and disorders that cause skin to grow in bizarre patterns and textures. But I have never in my entire career seen anything that even remotely resembles this." We immediately implemented the most comprehensive diagnostic protocol any of us had ever assembled for a single patient. Isabella was remarkably cooperative and understanding, seeming to grasp the unprecedented nature of her condition and the importance of thorough documentation and analysis. I ordered an extensive battery of blood tests, including complete metabolic panels, comprehensive autoimmune markers, inflammatory indicators, genetic screening for any known genes associated with bioluminescence, though none had ever been documented in humans, and extensive pathogen testing for any known bacteria, fungi, viruses, or parasites that could potentially cause unusual skin changes. We also scheduled Isabella for advanced imaging studies that went far beyond standard dermatological protocols. High-resolution ultrasound of the affected areas would help us understand if there were any structural changes in the deeper layers of skin tissue. Thermal imaging would reveal if the luminescent patches were producing heat along with light, which could provide clues about the underlying biological processes. We arranged for specialized photography using different wavelengths of light to document exactly which frequencies her skin was emitting, and to look for any patterns or changes in the light production over time. Most importantly, we needed tissue samples for comprehensive analysis. I explained to Isabella that we would need to perform multiple biopsies, small samples taken from different areas to understand the cellular and molecular changes that were occurring. We would take samples from the center of well-established luminescent patches, from the border areas where the transformation seemed to be actively occurring, and from completely normal skin for comparison. Isabella was incredibly brave throughout the informed consent process, asking thoughtful questions about each procedure and expressing her willingness to undergo whatever testing might help us understand her condition. "Dr. Vasquez," she said as I prepared the local anesthetic for the biopsies, "I know this sounds strange, but I actually want you to take as many samples as you need. If understanding what's happening to me might help other people or advance medical knowledge in some way, then the discomfort is worth it. I just want answers." The biopsy procedures themselves were routine from a technical standpoint, but watching the local anesthetic take effect in the luminescent tissue was unlike anything I'd ever seen. As the lidocaine spread through the glowing skin, the light production in that immediate area dimmed slightly,
as if the anesthetic was somehow interfering with whatever biological process was creating the photons. The initial blood work results arrived within 24 hours, and they were completely frustratingly normal. Isabella's white blood cell count was perfect, showing no signs of infection or immune system activation. Her red blood cell count and hemoglobin levels were excellent, actually slightly better than average for a woman her age. Liver function, kidney function, thyroid levels, and electrolyte balance were all within ideal ranges. Her autoimmune markers, tests that would reveal if her immune system was attacking her own tissue, were completely negative. If anything, Isabella's overall health markers suggested someone in exceptional physical condition. Her cholesterol levels were optimal, her blood sugar was perfectly stable, and even her vitamin and mineral levels were in the high normal range. There was absolutely nothing in her blood work that could explain or even hint at the impossible transformation occurring in her skin, but it was the tissue analysis that truly shook our understanding of what we were dealing with. Dr. Rodriguez spent 3 full days analyzing the biopsy samples, working with specialized equipment that could examine cellular structure at the molecular level. He consulted with colleagues at major medical centers around the country, and even reached out to marine biologists who studied bioluminescent organisms in the ocean. On Thursday evening, he called me at home, and I could hear the bewilderment and excitement in his voice. "Elena, I've been studying these tissue samples for 72 hours straight. I've consulted with pathologists at Johns Hopkins, the Mayo Clinic, Massachusetts General Hospital, and even contacted researchers at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, who specialize in bioluminescent marine life. What we're seeing in Isabella's tissue samples shouldn't exist in any human being on Earth."
The luminescent skin cells contained DNA that was identical to Isabella's normal cells. We confirmed this through genetic analysis. But their internal structure, their organelle arrangement, and their metabolic processes had been completely transformed. The cells had developed specialized organelles that appeared to be producing light through a biological process, remarkably similar to what researchers had documented in deep-sea creatures like certain jellyfish, types of plankton, and bioluminescent fish. Even more remarkably, these transformed cells were not only producing light, but were doing so while maintaining all their normal functions as human skin tissue. They were still providing barrier protection, temperature regulation, and sensory function. They had essentially gained an entirely new capability without losing any of their original biological roles. Over the following week, I had Isabella return to the hospital daily for monitoring, documentation, and continued analysis. What we observed during this period was both fascinating and deeply troubling. The luminescent patches were indeed spreading, expanding their coverage area every single day, but they weren't spreading randomly or chaotically. Instead, they seemed to follow specific biological patterns that suggested some kind of underlying intelligence or programming to the transformation process. The new areas of luminescence appeared to trace along nerve pathways, following the routes that electrical signals traveled through Isabella's body. They concentrated around areas of high cellular activity, near major blood vessels, around lymph nodes, and in regions where her skin was most metabolically active. Using time-lapse photography over several days, we documented that the transformation seemed to spread outward from the original patches in organized waves, like ripples moving across the surface of a pond. By day 3 of our intensive monitoring, the glowing areas had expanded to cover approximately 60% of Isabella's upper back, and were beginning to spread down her arms in clear symmetrical patterns. The progression was steady and predictable, roughly 2 to 3 new square inches of skin per day, undergoing the impossible transformation from normal human tissue to light-producing cells. Perhaps most disturbing was what we discovered about the transformation process itself when we examined it under high-powered microscopes with time-lapse capability. Normal human skin cells were somehow reprogramming themselves over a period of approximately 72 hours. First, the cells would begin to show dramatically increased metabolic activity, consuming nutrients and oxygen at rates far above normal cellular function. Then, over the course of the second day, entirely new subcellular structures would begin to form minus organelles that had no equivalent in normal human cells but bore striking resemblance to the light-producing structures found in bioluminescent marine organisms. Finally, on the third day, the cells would begin producing steady, continuous light, while simultaneously maintaining all their original functions as skin tissue. The transformed cells were actually more efficient than normal skin cells in many measurable ways. They healed faster, they were more resistant to damage, and they showed enhanced sensitivity to environmental stimuli. realizing that Isabella's case was completely beyond anything in standard medical literature and potentially represented a breakthrough in our understanding of human biology. I began reaching out to researchers and specialists at major medical institutions around the world. I compiled comprehensive documentation, including photographs, video recordings, tissue samples, and detailed medical histories, then sent this information to leading experts in genetics, cellular biology, and dermatology. I contacted Dr. Catherine Walsh at Harvard Medical School's Department of Genetics, who was renowned for her research into cellular modification and genetic engineering. I reached out to researchers at the Mayo Clinic's Advanced Dermatology Research Center, specialists at Johns Hopkins who studied rare genetic conditions, and even contacted marine biologists at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution who might have insights into how bioluminescence functions in living organisms. The responses I received over the following weeks were consistent and deeply troubling. Every expert who examined Isabella's case, whether through the documentation I provided or through direct video consultations, confirmed that what we were observing was scientifically impossible according to current understanding of human biology. Dr. Walsh called me personally after spending a full weekend reviewing our data and consulting with her research team. "Elena," she said, her voice containing a mixture of excitement and concern that I'd never heard from such an accomplished scientist, "I've been studying genetic modifications, cellular engineering, and the theoretical limits of human biological adaptation for 30 years. I've worked on cutting-edge research involving genetic therapies, cellular reprogramming, and even experimental treatments that push the boundaries of what we thought human cells could do." She paused, and I could hear her taking a deep breath before continuing. "What you've documented with Isabella's case suggests that her cells have somehow acquired the ability to perform biological functions that took millions of years of evolution to develop in other species, and they're doing it while maintaining perfect human cellular function. This isn't just medically unprecedented. It challenges our fundamental understanding of how evolution works, how genetic adaptation occurs, and what the theoretical limits of human biology might be." Throughout this period of intensive study, testing, and consultation with experts around the world, I spent considerable time talking with Isabella about her subjective experience of this transformation. What she told me was as unsettling and remarkable as the objective medical evidence we were gathering through our various tests and examinations. "Dr. Vasquez," she said during one of our daily consultation sessions, "I need you to understand that I can feel every single cell that changes. This isn't something happening to me passively. I'm aware of the transformation at the most fundamental level. It's not painful, but it's incredibly intense. Like each individual cell is waking up from a deep sleep and suddenly becoming more alive and aware than it ever was before." She described sensations that had no equivalent in normal human experience. The affected areas of her skin had developed enhanced sensitivity to touch, temperature, air pressure, and even electromagnetic fields. She could feel the electrical activity in my smartphone when I placed it near her luminescent skin. She could sense changes in atmospheric pressure hours before weather systems moved through the Phoenix area. Most remarkably, she claimed she could detect the health and emotional states of people who came into physical contact with her transformed skin. "When you examine me during these sessions," she said quietly, "I can feel your concern, your scientific curiosity, and your confusion through the contact with my skin. It's not telepathy or anything supernatural. It's more like the light-producing cells are picking up on bioelectric signals, pheromones, or other subtle indicators that normal human skin can't detect. It's as if this transformation has given me access to information that was always there but that I was never able to perceive before." Even more unsettling was her description of what it felt like when new areas of skin began to transform. "I can sense it starting about 24 hours before it becomes visible," she explained. "There's a tingling sensation, almost like mild electrical activity, in areas where the change is going to begin. Then I start to feel more aware of that part of my body, like those cells are becoming more awake and more connected to my consciousness. By the time you can see the light beginning to appear, I've been feeling the internal changes for days." By the end of the second week of intensive monitoring and analysis, Isabella's condition had progressed to cover most of her torso and arms. The luminescent areas now included approximately 75% of her upper body, and she reported that she could feel the transformation beginning in her legs as well. The light production had also intensified. The affected areas were now bright enough to serve as actual illumination in a dark room. But even more concerning were the additional changes we began to observe that went far beyond simple bioluminescence. The affected skin wasn't just producing light, it was also showing dramatically enhanced healing capabilities that defied everything we knew about human tissue repair.
When we performed follow-up biopsies to monitor the progression of the cellular changes, the biopsy sites in luminescent areas healed completely within 18 to 24 hours, leaving absolutely no scarring or visible indication that tissue had ever been removed. Normal human skin at the biopsy sites, areas that hadn't yet undergone the transformation, took the expected 7 to 10 days to heal and left small but permanent scars as we would expect from any minor surgical procedure. The accelerated healing in the transformed tissue suggested that these cells had not only gained the ability to produce light, but had also somehow enhanced their regenerative capabilities far beyond normal human levels. Isabella also reported significant changes in her overall energy levels, sleep patterns, and general sense of well-being. "Dr. Vasquez, I haven't felt tired in over a week," she told me during one of our sessions. "I'm sleeping only 3 to 4 hours per night, but I feel more rested and alert than I ever have in my life. It's like whatever is happening to my skin is making my entire body more efficient at producing and utilizing energy." Her appetite had changed as well. She was eating less food overall, but craving specific nutrients, particularly foods high in certain minerals and vitamins that, when we researched them, turned out to be essential components in the biochemical processes that create bioluminescence in marine organisms. Word of Isabel's unprecedented case began to spread through the medical community, despite our best efforts to maintain patient confidentiality and control the flow of information. Colleagues from other departments started finding excuses to visit our dermatology unit, hoping to catch a glimpse of the glowing patient they'd heard whispered about in hospital corridors and medical staff meetings. Visiting physicians from other hospitals requested consultations, and medical students asked if they could observe our examinations for educational purposes. Hospital administrators became increasingly concerned about potential liability issues and the growing attention Isabella's case was attracting. They worried about media exposure, patient privacy violations, and the possibility that our hospital might become known for sensational cases rather than solid medical practice. More troubling were the phone calls I began receiving from government agencies and organizations I'd never heard of before. Representatives from the Centers for Disease Control called requesting copies of all our documentation, tissue samples, and detailed medical records. Officials from the Department of Health and Human Services wanted to send their own specialists to examine Isabella personally. Even more mysteriously, I received calls from people claiming to represent military research facilities, asking about the potential applications of Isabella's condition for various unspecified purposes. One particularly unsettling call came from someone who identified himself only as Dr. Mitchell from a government research facility, who seemed to know far more about Isabella's case than should have been possible given our efforts to maintain confidentiality. He asked detailed questions about the light wavelengths her skin was producing, the efficiency of the bioluminescent process, and whether we had observed any communication or networking capabilities between different patches of transformed skin. The medical marvel we were documenting was quickly becoming something that attracted attention from people and organizations with interests that seemed to extend far beyond patient care and scientific understanding. I began to worry that Isabella was being viewed not as a person with a mysterious medical condition, but as a potential resource or asset that various groups wanted to study, control, or potentially exploit. It was during the 3rd week of Isabella's treatment that I received a phone call that fundamentally changed my understanding of what we were dealing with. Dr. Michael Torres from the University of California, San Francisco contacted me after hearing about our case through informal professional networks, the kind of colleague-to-colleague communication that happens when doctors encounter something truly unprecedented. "Dr. Vasquez," he said, his voice containing an urgency that immediately got my attention. "I think you need to know that your patient Isabella isn't the only one experiencing this condition. We have a patient here with nearly identical symptoms, a 32-year-old man whose skin began producing bioluminescent light approximately 6 weeks ago. The progression, the cellular changes, even the enhanced healing capabilities are all remarkably similar to what you've described in the case summary you circulated to research colleagues." The phone felt heavy in my hand as the implications of this information began to sink in. If Isabella's condition wasn't unique, if there were multiple people experiencing the same impossible transformation, then this wasn't a random genetic mutation or an isolated environmental exposure. This suggested something far more systematic, something that was either spreading between people through some unknown mechanism or affecting multiple individuals simultaneously through some shared cause that we hadn't identified. "Dr. Torres," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "how many cases are you aware of?" There was a long pause before he answered, and I could hear papers rustling as if he were consulting notes or files. Based on the inquiries, 6 months after leaving medicine, I received one final encrypted message. Isabella had escaped. The government facility had been compromised when 17 transformed individuals coordinated their bioluminescent abilities to overload the electronic security systems. They had vanished without a trace, their light-based communication network allowing them to coordinate across impossible distances. The message included a location, a remote cabin in Montana, where Isabella was waiting. When I arrived, I barely recognized her. The transformation had completed itself. Her entire body glowed with soft, pulsing light, and her eyes held an intelligence that seemed to encompass far more than one human consciousness. "Dr. Vasquez," she said, her voice somehow harmonizing with itself. "We're not disappearing. We're multiplying. There are now over 300 of us across 6 continents. The transformation isn't random. It's selective. We're becoming what humanity needs to be to survive what's coming." She touched my hand, and for a brief moment I felt it. The connection, the network, the vast intelligence that linked them all together. "Thank you for believing in us when no one else would," she said as I felt the familiar warm tingling begin to spread across my palm. The bioluminescent transformation had found me too, and I finally understood. This wasn't a medical condition to be cured. It was evolution calling humanity forward into something greater than we had ever imagined possible. The light doesn't lie, and neither does change.